Everyone laughed at the young lady for renting an ugly, abandoned house. But what happened months later left the landlord speechless. When Ada first saw the house, many people in the neighborhood shook their heads. The building looked tired and forgotten. The paint had faded. The windows were broken. Weeds had grown all around the compound. Some people even whispered, "Why would anyone rent a place like this?" But Ada simply smiled. She quietly paid the rent for 3 years and moved in. To everyone's surprise, something began to change. Week after week, workers came to the house. Carpenters repaired doors. Painters covered the old walls with bright colors. Gardeners planted flowers and trimmed the grass. Little by little, the old house began to shine again. Soon, the once-forgotten building looked like a beautiful paradise. The compound had fresh flowers. The walls were shining. The inside looked modern and comfortable. Neighbors passing by would stop and admire the transformation. Some even said, "Who knew this place could become so beautiful?" But one person was watching everything carefully: the landlord. At first, he said nothing, but as the house began more beautiful, a new thought entered his mind. One afternoon, he came to visit Ada. He stood in the compound, looking around with wide eyes. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Ada, I want you to start preparing to leave this house." Ada looked surprised. "Leave? But my rent has not finished. I still have years remaining." The landlord folded his arms. "My son is getting married soon. He will move into this house with his wife." Ada was shocked. "But sir, I paid for 3 years." Just then, a car drove into the compound. A young man stepped out confidently. It was the landlord's son. He walked toward Ada and said firmly, "Lady, you need to start packing. This house will be my wedding gift to my wife." Ada felt a deep wave of anger rising inside her, but she stayed calm. "I am not leaving," she replied quietly. "If there is a problem, we can settle it in court." The landlord laughed and brought out a document. "Here is the agreement you signed." Ada took the paper and began to read carefully. At first, her heart sank. The paper did not say anything about renovations. It only confirmed that she rented the house. She almost lost hope. But suddenly, her eyes stopped at one small line. Her heart jumped. The paper clearly said, "Any property placed in the house by the tenant that does not belong to the landlord may be removed by the tenant when leaving the house." And the most important part, the landlord had signed it. Ada slowly folded the paper. A small smile appeared on her face. "All right," she said calmly. "I will leave." The landlord and his son smiled proudly. But what Ada did next, no one in the neighborhood expected it. The next morning, several trucks arrived at the house. Workers entered the compound and they began removing everything. The beautiful lights, the new doors, the flower decorations, the fancy wall panels, the shining fittings. Piece by piece, the beautiful house slowly returned to how it looked before. By evening, Ada locked the gate for the last time and quietly left. But the landlord and his son had no idea what had happened inside. They were too busy planning the wedding. The next day, the son proudly brought his new bride to the house. Guests gathered around the compound. Smiling, the son said proudly, "My wife, wait until you see the beautiful home I prepared for you." The father nodded proudly. "My son, open the door and show everyone." The son stepped forward, turned the key, and opened the door. The moment the door opened, everyone froze. Then suddenly, people began screaming in surprise. The bride looked at her husband with disappointment. "How could you embarrass me like this on my wedding day?" And before anyone could explain, then she walked away. At that moment, the landlord realized something was terribly wrong, and he quickly picked up his phone to call Ada. But he had no idea that the biggest lesson of his life was about to begin. The compound was filled with whispers. Guests stood in small groups discussing what had just happened. The bride had already left. David stood quietly, still holding the wedding ring she had thrown at him. His father, the landlord, looked frustrated and embarrassed. Then his phone rang. It was Ada. She had already seen the missed calls. "I'm on my way," she said calmly. A few minutes later, Ada arrived at the house. At the same time, a police officer also arrived because the landlord had reported the situation. The landlord immediately pointed at the house. "Look at what you did," he said angrily. "Explain why you removed everything from my house." But Ada did not raise her voice. She quietly brought out the rental agreement paper. "Sir," she said respectfully, "please read this part again." The landlord grabbed the paper and looked at it. The police officer also stepped closer. Ada pointed at the line that said, "Any property placed in the house by the tenant that does not belong to the landlord may be removed when the tenant leaves." Below that sentence was the landlord's signature. The police officer read it carefully and nodded. "She followed the agreement," he said. The landlord suddenly became quiet. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the neighbors who had been watching said softly, "But Ada paid for 3 years and she did not even stay up to that time." Some guests began murmuring again. "Yes, that is true. She still had time left." The police officer turned to the landlord. "Is that correct?" The landlord slowly nodded. "Yes, she paid in full." The officer then spoke calmly. "In that case, since she left early because you asked her to leave, the remaining rent should be returned to her." The landlord looked uncomfortable. He had not expected that. But everyone was now watching him. Even his son David looked down in silence. Ada did not say anything. She simply stood quietly. The police officer continued. "Fairness is important in agreements like this." The landlord sighed deeply. Slowly, he went inside the house and returned with an envelope. Inside was the remaining rent money. He handed it to Ada. "This is the balance of the rent you paid," he said quietly. Ada accepted the envelope politely. "Thank you, sir," she replied calmly. She turned to leave. But before she walked away, she said something that made everyone reflect. "I only wanted a peaceful place to live," she said. "I treated the house like my own home." Then she walked away slowly. The neighbors watched her leave with respect. Meanwhile, David sat quietly on the steps of the empty house. He looked around at the cracked walls and the broken windows. For the first time, he truly saw the house the way it had been before Ada came. His father stood beside him in silence. They had pushed away the one person who had made the house beautiful. Their pride had cost them a good tenant, a beautiful home, and even a peaceful wedding day. Sometimes the biggest lessons in life do not come with loud arguments. Sometimes they come quietly through the consequences of our own decisions. Moral lessons of the story. Always treat people fairly, especially those who improve what belongs to you. Greed and pride can make people lose valuable opportunities. Agreements should be respected by both sides. Kindness and patience often win in the end. When people act wisely and calmly, justice can speak for itself. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and follow for more stories.